Alright, hello and welcome. So today we're going to be talking about the Atlas rework, and the reason that we're talking about the Atlas rework first is, I'm going to be totally honest, because this is the rework that I think is the best and I like the most. So, that's the reason we're going to talk about it today. I think that it was pretty successful, so let's go over what's going on here. So, we have some dummies out here to show abilities on, and first and foremost, we have his one. His one is pretty much identical to how it's always functioned. It's very good. It does significant damage. As you can see, level 80 Butcher, even though of course these guys are chumps, got it down to basically 1 HP in one punch, and also his friend over here. And that's just, of course, the first punch of his combo that has escalating damage. So with that, that's pretty good. That continues to be very, very good and is helped greatly by his improvements on his 3. And then we have his 2. So his 2 is the unfortunate, pretty much the same as it ever was. This ability is still a thing that you can put over some like mobile defense terminals and things, or use it to block hallways sometimes, even though that's not very effective. And it can be rolled, which is kind of neither here nor there, because that's a really ineffective way to move enemies around or do damage, and 99.9% of the time, you're just going to punch them instead. The changes to this ability are basically that your 3, which is now this final flash-looking thing, which froze that guy over there as well, can now improve this wall and then make the roll, like, faster and go farther and... yeah, that stuff. Not very useful outside of the uses that it kind of already had, which is okay. Having one ability that's like kind of not used very much is pretty standard for really good Warframes in the game, so not a huge deal. Now let's talk a little bit more about his 3. So his 3 is no longer a channel. It is now nearly instant, and it instantly freezes anything caught in its wake, which is really, really good. And at base, it has a 20-second base duration, which is really, really good, and it has a 14-meter base range, which is pretty generous as well. So this ability is now fantastic, and part of the bread and butter of Atlas, because petrified enemies take more damage from his 1. So they die. Then we can talk about his new passive before we talk about his 4. So these are pieces of rubble. If you kill a petrified enemy, they do not have to be killed with your 1. They give you rubble. So this rubble will give you 75 armor when you pick it up, or alternatively, it will heal you if you need to be healed. And you can see it decaying there. It decays pretty rapidly. It decays at like 10 per second, which is pretty extreme and maybe a little over what it should be. With that, it also caps out at 1500, and given that Atlas only has 740 health when using a max to vitality, that is not particularly high for the tankiness that you would probably want Atlas to have, when, of course, also given that his rubble is decaying incredibly quickly. For me personally, I would like to see, also for those interested, whenever you're at max rubble, given Atlas's max normal armor of 450, he's getting about 2,000 armor with his 740 health, which is between like 5 and 6,000 EHP, which I feel is a little low. So I think there are some potential changes that can fix that fairly easily. One is to give him Nidus-like health, and just that would, of course, bulk him up significantly, and he would be very, very good at that point. Having anywhere from between, like, say, like 1,500 to like 2,000 HP would mean this amount of rubble is absolutely totally fine. But otherwise, just uncapping his rubble would be a very, very good way to go, because of the diminishing returns on armor increase. That means that you get to a point where more armor stops really being a thing that matters that much, except for to make it so that you have more time being super tough as Atlas, and also kind of properly snowballing in that the more enemies you kill, the more armor you get, and you can kind of just keep going. Given that it would take an obscene amount of armor for Atlas to reach the tankiness of even, say, Rhino, who usually sits at about like 100k EHP with his iron skin, I'll put the amount of armor that would take on screen. That's a lot to stack up. That'll take you quite some time to even just get to where Rhino usually sits around with his more tanky build. So, given that, I think that would be appropriate. Beyond that, let's talk about rumblers. So, with that, you can summon them, and they are as they ever were, basically. You can heal them with your 3 now, and they punch dudes, and they do okay damage. With that, you can terminate them early by hitting 4, as usual, and they drop rubble. So the main issue that I have here is that this one from this enemy, you get that, and that's 50 armor because they killed him. But from your rumblers themselves, when you terminate them early, you still get 50 armor. That's even with like super high strength or many other things, you still only get 50 armor from your rumblers, which is really unfortunate. It seems like that should be drastically higher, like at least 5 times that amount, maybe even 10, because it would be neat if you could like pop these guys early, boom, get their rubble. Okay, I'm like 2/3 of the way to my armor cap. Like that's at least some initial tankiness that you could rely on or something along those lines. And that would be cool. Or using that as like an initial burst, if you had uncapped armor, would be a really good way to get your tankiness up there and require you to interact with that ability in like more of a way. In general, I think that his 4 is still like not hugely useful and is more cool than actually really useful. With that, I think that a change to make it so that this ability is significantly more appealing and to make people definitely hit that button for sure, of course, is just to remove the duration on this ability and let the rumblers utilize their full health in running around and doing what they do, which is generally just punching dudes or spitting rocks at them. That is ineffective enough, I think, that if this ability had no duration on it whatsoever, much like Gara's wall, it would not be too crazy. I think that would be totally fine, and I think you would get a lot more moments in the game where cool stuff happens with the rumblers, as opposed to what I think it is right now, which is like, oh, I need to cast my rumblers again, I guess, for no real benefit, because most things are being taken care of by Atlas's 1 and his 3 at this point. So, while I think there is like a lot of potential still for the rumblers, and there's some minor improvements across like his 4, and across his 2 could definitely be improved. That's the for sure improvement. And I think his rubble should be at least slightly better than it is. Overall, this kit is really, really good. I cannot stress that enough, that while I do have problems with this kit, I think that it is a drastic improvement from where Atlas was to begin with, going from like way, way down to what he is now. Which I would say is at least a B+ for sure. Maybe even like spreading into the A category. And that's of course why I suggested some minor improvements for him to make him a definite solid A. And I think the most important of those improvements would be to his rubble to give him a better time with like keeping up with the tankiness of other Warframes that are above him at current. With that, I have 3 builds that I think are all good for different things. First and foremost is the one that we're going to be using for the full actual level 80 test, which is this one. This one I just called Long Stun because I'm super creative. So with that, he uses Steel Charge because his 1 benefits from that, and having more damage on your 1 is quite good. Besides that, it focuses on having a long stun, good range, and high efficiency. There are a lot of people, I think, that are going to gravitate towards using a solution like Rage or Hunter Adrenaline, which is the purely good rage, or the purely better rage, rather, for those that are not aware of that mod, instead of utilizing efficiency, but I think that is a mistake due to you being health invulnerable while using your 1. So while you're in the middle of your dash towards a target, your health can't be damaged, and that means that the upkeep on Hunter Adrenaline is significantly less consistent than it would be on someone like, say, Nidus or Inaros. With that, utilizing that is still fine, and I found it to work okay, especially if you want even more duration than something like this build, but I personally prefer fleeting. With that, I know some people are skeptical already of the amount of strength that is on this build. Given an appropriate stat stick for Atlas, though, you're going to be doing absolutely plenty of damage, and really murdering pretty much anything that is at like Swordy 2 level at this amount of strength with an appropriate stat stick. Given that, some people are going to want more damage, and that is what the high damage variant is for. This has slightly more efficiency, it has less range, it focuses more on doing more damage. An increase of this much more strength, this like 60% more strength, it is not to be laughed at. For Atlas, that's his base damage, which is then modified by his stat stick. So that's a significant portion extra damage that you will definitely notice if you choose to go with a build like this instead. And as I mentioned earlier, his 3's base stun duration is already quite generous at 20 seconds, and you're going to have basically that exact duration for that. The main thing hurting on this build is the less range, but of course you could just swap out Mobilize for the Drift that gives you a little more range to patch that up a little bit if you don't care about being fast as much as I do. With that, we have the final build, and this is for... I know I call this low levels, but what I actually mean is the star chart. So if you're not going into like an event, or if you're not going into like sorties, or you're not going into like some other high level content, maybe the dark sectors when those come back, which would probably have significantly escalated levels. This is going to absolutely fucking slaughter. Anything that is under level 50 ain't gonna fucking survive very long if this thing is in the room. Because your max range, that means you're punching everybody. Everyone is getting punched at the same time. Which is not only pretty impressive, but also is really effective for killing everyone. So yeah, like low-level enemies that don't really pose a threat to you, this is an absolutely great direction to go. Along with that, obviously, I've dropped Primed Flow in this build because it is not as necessary for enemies that pose no threat and are usually in swarms, because they'll give you more energy. They don't get a choice. With that, obviously, I said we were going to be showing this build off because it is the one that I prefer. And even though it is not... Oh, also, before I forget, I have to show off my stat stick. So this is the stat stick that I'm utilizing. This is the old meme build, basically, for Atlas, but it's an effective meme. This is using the Primed Heavy Trauma and Collision Force mods, and because his one is all impact damage, these are actually good choices to be made in pretty much just this build. Along with that, I'm utilizing the Venka Prime because they have a better combo multiplier, which his one can take advantage of. And while you could get more damage by putting some Forma into this, and then using the higher elemental variants to get Blast and Corrosive at the same time, my preference is to go with like pretty much all Corrosive, because the one thing that can really stop up your one is Ancient Healers, but they are very weak to Corrosive, so they're just going to get blown away regardless, as long as they're in the AoE of your one. So this works very, very well. And also, like I said, his one gets benefit from the melee combo, which is why Drift and Contact is in here. Though, obviously, you could use Body Count instead if you really care about those 2 seconds. Also, to warn against people that are going to try and build his one for status, when enemies are petrified, they're immune to status. So, probably don't do that. And, for those of you thinking about using Shattering Impact... This mod, strangely, because it's supposed to activate from impact damage, doesn't work with Atlas's one, which is definitely a weird one. I kind of wish it did. It's a bit odd that it doesn't, but it doesn't, so there you have it. Anyway, let's finally get to this test. It will be mopped up very quickly, as if there is one thing Atlas is good at, it is punching dudes. So this is going to be our standard test at level 80, of course, because that is usually what I do for Warframe tests, because then you're using the Warframe and usually using weapons, not in Atlas's case. Unpause the AI, and here we go. So yeah, this 3, really effective. Obviously, with this amount of range, which is not the, like, 280, not the 280 build, remind you, you're getting some significant damage. Enemies don't really survive this one. Missed with my 3. Your 3 is, like, really mean. Also works through walls, as you can see there. It's really mean. And also, because I don't think I mentioned it, I think my actual, like, biggest gripe with rubble is that the pieces of rubble are not affected by vacuum, which is just a chore. Like, playing Atlas for long periods of time and, like, picking up all the... It's the same reason that fucking so many people use vacuum everywhere. It's because it's a fucking chore to have to pick all, like, the garbage that's on the ground up. And it would just make him flow so much better if you weren't constantly, like, doing 3 punches and then being like, okay, well, fucking, I guess I'm gonna pick up all my toys and go home. Because it just breaks up the gameplay in a bad way. That being said, I've seen a ton of people ask for his rubble to be vacuumable, so I really hope DE does that, at the very least, to make Atlas significantly more enjoyable to play. Anyway, that is the Atlas rework. It is very good. Atlas is significantly improved by this, and I could only be slightly happier with the rework, I suppose. But yeah, that is the first video for this week. I suspect Atlas will get changed at some point, and I'll have to make even another video with the kind of trend things have been going through. But, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you tomorrow.